Yes. Another question there.
I have a question, I don't have a comment. I just want to understand, because we only talked about Europe within Europe and not from the outside. Basically, we talked about the Berlin Wall only within Europe, not from what effects it had outside European Union now or outside Soviet Union. So basically, because of course we know that it had an effect in Albania, for example, which was not part of the Soviet Union. But it was a very positive thing, although with some troubles. But then it had another effect in Yugoslavia, because right after then, maybe not directly, but indirectly, that we saw the dissolvement of Yugoslavia, although it ended in '99 with in a different shape, unfortunately. I also want to raise another question. Do you also see the Berlin Wall, the fact that the Berlin Wall is not there? Now we have a rise of China. Now I want to go to China. So basically I want to link it with like, there are no more energies spent within Europe. Now other parts of the world are benefiting, in parentheses, from this thing. So basically I just want to understand from outside of Europe and from outside of Soviet Union or European Union.
So the question of what are the externalities of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Indeed, we looked at Europe, we looked at the former Soviet Union, but what about the players, the other players in the world even? There's a lot of talk about China, about other countries as India, for example, coming up, the BRIC countries. So, what is your comment on that? That's the question.
Okay, these are once again very closely interrelated questions, and I'm glad that you raised the issue of China, because I strongly believe that the course China decided to take was very, very heavily influenced by events of what happened in the Soviet Union. And I think the very fact that the Soviet Empire collapsed made it very clear to the Chinese Communist Party that their power can be maintained only if they improve tremendously on economic efficiency, and as a consequence they abandoned the non-market structure, which was one of the basic ideological bastions of Marxism-Leninism. So China is no longer a socialist country if you mean by socialist that it's a non-market system. It's a more liberal market-oriented system in many respects than Western Europe, for example, with all the cruelty and less human face as it goes with that. But at the same time, I think there is a further consequence which is equally important. Basically that today, that type of non-market, undemocratic socialism has been discredited forever, globally. And you mentioned Angola, Ethiopia, Mozambique. There were a lot of many other countries, Nicaragua, etc., which were trying to opt for the Soviet model. Today you have North Korea and Cuba, that's all. And these countries are going down the drain very, very fast. So they cannot really constitute any attractive model for any new power which may come about. And this is important because previously we were talking about the first world and the second world having led by two superpowers dominating the global affairs, and then the so-called third world consisting of countries which were kind of obliged to decide which way to go, because there was very little room for becoming neutral or opting for a third way. Today this is not true. You have within capitalism so many different sub-types of capitalism. Even the communist, the Chinese model could be regarded as one extreme example of liberal capitalism on the one hand, when it comes to protecting human rights and freedom of speech and trade unions and what have you. In this respect, it's an absolutely unfettered capitalism. On the other hand, it's a state capitalistic system which is good enough in helping the present elite to perpetuate its power. But other than rhetoric, it is no longer a communist system. It's just a brutal one-party state, no democracy whatsoever, trying to hang on to power, and not least because that's the best way for them to preserve the empire, the imperial structure, which holds China together. Because don't forget, in Russia today, one reason why Gorbachev is not popular at all, like I was 14 years ago, is not because the communist system was dissolved, but because the empire was lost. And even if you listen to what Putin has to say almost every other day, he keeps saying that the largest tragedy of the 20th century was the dismemberment or dissolution of the Soviet Union. For me, if somebody speaks like that, cannot be called a Democrat, that's for sure. But it's interesting to see and to understand that basically, as a consequence of this dismemberment of the Soviet Empire and the shrinking of Russia, both in terms of economic might and geopolitical and military might, has created a very negative mindset in the Russian elite, and they really feel what Putin says very openly. And this is a lesson for China. This is one of the strongest lessons for China, and the reason why they want to keep and perpetuate the one-party state and dictatorial model is because they want to keep China together.
Interesting.
It is true that this globalization doesn't come out of nothing. And next to the Soviet bloc and the American bloc, there was the non-alignment movement, or the end of the Third World, and communism, or the socialist system, or socialist economy was appealing for many decolonizing powers, including India. Indira Gandhi, the ruler of India in the 1970s, flirted with Brezhnev much more than with the United States. India has had 5 years plans from the 1950s on, with big state economy. Still has. Although from the 1980s, Indira Gandhi was then succeeded by Rajiv Gandhi, who had been educated in Cambridge, was married to an Italian wife, so they're two in the 1980s. About China, if you can simplify things, the difference between Russia and China is that Russia liberalized politics, but did not change its economy, and there the elite remains in power. While China liberalized its economy, but did not change its politics. And if 1989 is remembered for the Berlin Wall, maybe not the 9th and 10th of November is the most important date of 1989, but the weekend of the 3rd and the 4th of June 1989. Because in that weekend, first, the Poles had their first party-free elections, and Solidarność gained an enormous victory. And second, Tiananmen, there was the disaster of Tiananmen, the crash of the students' revolution. And in the same weekend, Ayatollah Khomeini died. So this was a historical weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, other questions? perhaps